The more you seek approval, the more invisible you become. You think asking for validation makes you likable, but actually, it slowly trains people to see you as someone who doesn't even trust themselves. And most people never realize this, because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, subtly, one small compromise at a time, until one day you wake up and you don't even recognize who you've become. You check your phone before you trust your own thoughts. You replay conversations not to understand, but to correct yourself. You filter your words, your tone, your opinions, not based on truth, but based on what will be accepted. And here's the part that's hard to admit. You already know you're doing it. You feel it every time you hesitate before speaking. You feel it when you change your answer just to match the room. You feel it when someone disagrees with you, and your first instinct isn't to stand firm, but to adjust, to soften, to retreat. This is not confidence. This is not kindness. This is not emotional intelligence. This is dependency. And dependency is the quietest form of self-destruction, because it disguises itself as being easy to work with, as being nice, as being understanding. But beneath all of that is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being judged, fear of standing alone. And that fear is controlling your life more than you think. Every time you wait for someone to approve your decision before you act, you weaken your ability to lead yourself. Every time you look for reassurance instead of trusting your instinct, you teach your mind that your judgment is not enough. And over time, that voice inside you, the one that used to be clear, decisive, sharp, becomes quieter. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped listening. You replaced it with noise, opinions, reactions, external signals that constantly shift depending on who you're around. So now you're adapting, constantly adjusting, becoming a different version of yourself in every room. And at first, it feels like you're winning. People don't argue with you. You avoid conflict. You blend in smoothly. But there's a hidden cost. People don't remember you. They don't feel your presence. They don't look to you when decisions need to be made. Because deep down, they can sense it. They can feel that you're not anchored, that you're waiting, that you're measuring yourself through their eyes. And once that perception is formed, it's almost impossible to reverse without changing everything about how you operate. You see, people don't consciously say, "This person seeks approval." It's more subtle than that. It shows up in how they interrupt you, in how they don't fully listen, in how they hesitate to take you seriously. Because respect is not given to those who constantly adjust themselves. Respect is given to those who remain consistent, even under pressure. And right now, if you're honest, consistency is exactly what you've been sacrificing. You've been trading it for acceptance, trading it for comfort, trading it for temporary peace in conversations where you could have stood your ground. And maybe you justify it. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal. I just don't want conflict. I'm being flexible. But flexibility without a core is not strength. It's instability. Because if everything about you can be adjusted depending on who you're with, then there is nothing solid for people to respect. And more importantly, there is nothing solid for you to stand on. That's why it feels exhausting. That's why you overthink simple interactions. That's why you feel drained after social situations that should have been neutral. Because you're not just being present, you're performing, constantly calculating, constantly scanning for reactions, constantly asking the silent question, was that okay? And that question is the chain. Because as long as you keep asking it, you are giving other people authority over your internal state. Your confidence rises and falls based on how they respond. Your mood shifts based on their approval. Your sense of self becomes unstable because it's no longer self-generated. And here's the dangerous part. The longer you live like this, the more normal it feels. You start believing that this is just how life works, that everyone does this, that you have to adapt, to please, to fit in order to survive socially. But that's not true. There's another layer that most people never reach, a layer where your actions are not driven by approval, but by alignment, where you speak because it's true, not because it's accepted, where you act because it's right, not because it's validated. And reaching that level requires something most people avoid at all costs: discomfort. Because the moment you stop seeking approval, things will change. People will react differently. Some will question you. Some will misunderstand you. Some will even distance themselves. And that's exactly why you've been avoiding it. Not because you don't know what to do, but because you're afraid of what will happen when you actually do it. You're afraid of standing alone in a room where you used to blend in. You're afraid of being judged instead of accepted. You're afraid of losing connections that were never real to begin with, because they were built on a version of you that wasn't fully honest. And that's the truth you've been avoiding. Many of the relationships you're protecting by seeking approval are conditional. They exist because you've been adjusting yourself to maintain them. And the moment you stop, they will be tested. Not all of them will survive. And that realization is uncomfortable. But it's also necessary, because a life built on constant approval is not a life of freedom. It's a life of quiet control, where you are always reacting, never leading, always adjusting, never deciding, always waiting, never becoming. And if you don't interrupt this pattern now, it doesn't just stay in conversations. It spreads into your career, your decisions, your standards, your entire identity. You start choosing paths that feel safe instead of meaningful. You start avoiding risks not because they're wrong, but because they might not be approved. You start shrinking your potential to fit into expectations that were never yours to begin with. And years pass like that, not in failure, but in limitation. And that's the real danger. Not that you'll collapse, but that you'll live a life that is slightly below what you were capable of, without ever fully realizing why. So understand this clearly. The problem is not that you care about people. The problem is that you've placed their approval above your own clarity. You've trained yourself to look outward before you look inward. And until you reverse that, nothing changes. Because no matter how much advice you hear, no matter how much motivation you consume, if your default state is still, what will they think, then you are still operating from the same position. And that position is beneath your own potential. So the question is not whether you should stop seeking approval. The question is, how much longer are you willing to let it control you before you decide that enough is enough? Let's strip the illusion away immediately. People do not admire those who constantly seek approval. They simply use them as emotional background noise. And the harsh truth is this: the more agreeable you become, the less significant you are perceived, because significance requires friction, and you have trained yourself to avoid friction at all costs. You thought being easygoing would make you valuable, but in reality, it makes you forgettable, because there is nothing to push against, nothing to define you, nothing that signals you have a spine strong enough to stand alone. And in a world where everyone is quietly measuring everyone else, the one who bends too easily is never taken seriously, only accommodated. And being accommodated is not respect. It is controlled tolerance, a subtle form of dismissal dressed up as politeness. Now understand the psychological layer beneath this, because this is where it becomes dangerous. You are not just seeking approval, you are negotiating your identity in real time, constantly scanning faces, tones, micro-reactions, trying to adjust yourself to fit what you think is expected. And your brain is wired to reward this behavior temporarily, because social acceptance feels like safety. But that reward is short-lived and addictive. It keeps you coming back for more validation, more reassurance, more signs that you are okay. And over time, this rewires your internal compass. You stop asking, "Is this right?" and start asking, "Will this be accepted?" And that shift, subtle as it seems, is the beginning of losing control over your own life. Because once your decisions are filtered through external approval, you are no longer acting, you are reacting. And reactive people never lead. They follow the emotional currents of whoever is around them, becoming fragments of different personalities stitched together without a core. Now picture a real scenario, not something abstract, something you've lived through more times than you can count. You're in a conversation, maybe at work, maybe with friends. Someone says something you don't fully agree with. You feel that small internal resistance, that instinct that says, "This isn't right." But instead of expressing it, you pause, you calculate, you soften your stance, maybe you nod, maybe you say something neutral. Maybe you even adjust your opinion slightly, just to keep the atmosphere smooth. And in that exact moment, something important happens. Not externally, no one notices. The conversation continues, everything seems fine. But internally, you just taught yourself that your truth is negotiable. And the more you repeat that pattern, the easier it becomes to silence yourself. Until eventually, you don't even feel the resistance anymore, because you've trained yourself not to. So here's rule number 1. And it will feel uncomfortable the moment you try it. Stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, because over-explaining is a signal of insecurity. It tells people you are seeking permission for your own position. And the more you justify, the more you imply that your stance cannot stand on its own. And powerful people understand something you've been avoiding. Clarity does not require validation. When you say something, you let it stand. You don't chase agreement. You don't fill silence with nervous explanations. You allow the weight of your words to exist without cushioning them. And yes, this will create tension. But tension is not your enemy. It is the space where respect is formed. Now move deeper into rule number 2. Detach from reactions. Completely, not partially, not selectively, but fully. Because the moment you attach your emotional state to how others respond, you give them control over you. And control is the foundation of all power dynamics, whether you see it or not. So when you say something and immediately look for a reaction, you are placing yourself in a lower position. You are waiting to be evaluated. And that waiting is visible. It leaks through your body language, your tone, your timing, everything. So instead, you must learn to act and release. You speak, you decide, you move, and then you let the outcome exist without interference. No checking, no second guessing, no mental replay. Because the moment you start chasing a reaction, you are no longer grounded in yourself. You are reaching outward again, and that reaching is what weakens you. Now understand rule number 3. And this is where most people collapse. You must become comfortable being misunderstood, not occasionally, but consistently. Because if you are always understood, it means you are always aligning yourself with what is already accepted. And there is no authority in that. Authority requires deviation. It requires standing in a position that not everyone agrees with. And that will trigger discomfort, not just in others, but in you. Because you've conditioned yourself to equate agreement with safety. So when disagreement appears, your instinct will be to retreat, to soften, to fix it. But this is the exact moment you must resist that urge. Because every time you hold your position despite misunderstanding, you reinforce your internal authority. You tell yourself that your value does not depend on being approved, and that repetition builds something far more stable than temporary acceptance. Let's reinforce this from another angle so it sinks deeper. Seeking approval is not just a habit. It is a strategy you learn to avoid rejection. But the irony is that in trying to avoid rejection, you reject yourself first. You abandon your own thoughts, your own instincts, your own voice, before anyone else even has the chance to challenge you. And that self-abandonment accumulates over time. It creates a subtle internal conflict, a sense that something is off, that you are not fully aligned. And that misalignment drains your energy more than any external pressure ever could. Because you are constantly splitting yourself between who you are and who you think you need to be. And that split is exhausting. Now loop back to the core idea again, but from a sharper perspective. The reason people who don't seek approval appear powerful is not because they are always right. It is because they are consistent, and consistency signals certainty, and certainty is interpreted as strength, even when it is not perfect, while inconsistency, even when well-intentioned, is interpreted as weakness, because it shows you are easily influenced, easily shaped, easily moved, and people, consciously or not, gravitate toward those who appear stable, not those who constantly adjust. So the real shift you need to make is not external, it is internal. You stop measuring yourself through others. You stop asking for silent permission. You stop negotiating your presence, and you start operating from a place where your actions are anchored in your own standards, not in fluctuating reactions. And this does not mean you become rigid or closed-minded. It means you become selective about when you adapt and when you stand firm. Because adaptation without control is submission, but adaptation with awareness is strategy. And right now, you have been operating in submission without realizing it. So bring it all together again. Every time you resist the urge to explain unnecessarily, you reclaim authority. Every time you detach from reactions, you regain control. Every time you allow yourself to be misunderstood without correcting it, you strengthen your identity. And these are not dramatic changes. They are small, repeated decisions that slowly rewire how you operate. And at first, it will feel unnatural, even wrong, because it contradicts the pattern you've been reinforcing for years. But that discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that you are finally breaking out of the loop. And the longer you stay in that discomfort without retreating, the more natural it becomes. Until eventually, you no longer feel the need to seek approval at all. not because you forced it, but because you outgrew it. And when that happens, something shifts in how people perceive you, not because you tried to change their perception, but because you changed the way you carry yourself. And that change cannot be faked. It cannot be performed. It can only be built through repeated alignment with your own internal authority. And once that foundation is solid, approval becomes irrelevant. Not rejected, not avoided, just irrelevant. And that is the point where you stop being controlled by the need for it. Everything comes down to this. Your life is shaped by what you tolerate inside your own mind. And right now, whether you admit it or not, you have been tolerating a silent dependency on approval that has been dictating your actions, your decisions, your identity. And the most dangerous part is that it doesn't feel like control. It feels like normal behavior. It feels like being aware, like being socially intelligent, like being considerate. But strip away the labels, and what remains is simple. You have been asking for permission to exist as yourself. And the longer you continue this pattern, the more you drift away from anything real, anything grounded, anything that actually belongs to you. Because when your sense of self is built on external reactions, it has no stability, no core, no permanence. It rises when people approve and collapses when they don't. And that instability forces you into a constant state of adjustment, a constant state of quiet anxiety, where every interaction becomes a test, every silence becomes a threat, every reaction becomes a signal you must interpret. And living like that is not just exhausting, it is limiting in ways you haven't fully understood yet, because it doesn't just affect how you speak, it affects what you choose, what you pursue, what you avoid. It narrows your path until you are only moving in directions that feel safe, acceptable, approved. And safety like that is not protection, it is confinement. So understand this clearly, not emotionally, not vaguely, but with precision. If you want to reclaim control over your life, you must be willing to sever your reliance on approval completely, not partially, not when it's convenient, but entirely. Because partial detachment is still dependence. It just hides itself better. And as long as there is even a small part of you that needs validation before you act, that part will eventually control the whole. And this is where the final rule becomes unavoidable. If you want real authority, you must act without waiting for agreement. You must decide without needing reassurance. You must move without checking if it will be accepted. Because authority is not granted by others, it is assumed by you. And the moment you hesitate, the moment you look around for confirmation, you give that authority away before you even had the chance to use it. Now, this does not mean you become reckless or blind to feedback. It means feedback no longer defines you, it informs you. There is a difference. One controls your direction, the other refines it. And most people never learn to separate the two. They confuse criticism with rejection, disagreement with disapproval, silence with judgment. And because of that confusion, they spend their lives adjusting themselves to avoid discomfort, never realizing that discomfort is the exact price required for independence. And here is the truth that will unsettle you if you are honest. Most people will never escape this loop, not because they can't, but because they won't. Because the cost feels too high. The idea of being misunderstood, of being judged, of standing alone, even briefly, is enough to push them back into the familiar pattern of seeking approval. And over time, that pattern becomes their identity. They no longer see it as something they do, they see it as who they are. I'm just someone who cares what others think. I'm just someone who avoids conflict. And those labels become limitations, invisible walls that keep them exactly where they are. But you are standing at a different point right now, whether you realize it or not. Because once you see the pattern clearly, once you understand how deeply it has influenced you, you cannot unsee it. And that awareness creates a choice, a real one, not theoretical, not abstract, but practical, immediate, uncomfortable. You either continue as you have, adjusting, seeking, waiting, or you shift. You start making decisions from a place that does not require approval. And that shift will not feel powerful at first. It will feel wrong, unnatural, even isolating, because you are stepping outside of a system you have relied on for stability. But that discomfort is temporary. It is the withdrawal phase from a dependency you didn't even realize you had. And if you can stay in it, if you can resist the urge to return to old patterns, something begins to change, slowly at first, then more noticeably. Your thoughts become clearer, because they are no longer filtered through imagined reactions. Your actions become sharper because they are not delayed by hesitation. Your presence becomes stronger because it is not diluted by constant adjustment. And people will respond to that. Not always positively, not always comfortably, but differently, with a level of attention, of respect, that you did not receive before. And here is the irony. You will start receiving the very validation you used to chase, but it will arrive when you no longer depend on it, when you are no longer shaped by it, when it no longer has the power to control you. And at that point, you will understand something that most people never grasp, that approval was never the goal. It was a distraction, a substitute for something deeper, something more stable, self-trust. Because when you trust yourself fully, you do not need constant reassurance. You do not need external confirmation to move forward. You operate with a level of certainty that does not fluctuate with every opinion. And that certainty is what creates real confidence. Not the kind that is loud or performative, but the kind that is quiet, steady, unshaken. So bring it back to the core one final time. If you want to become someone who is respected, someone who has presence, someone who is not easily influenced or controlled, you must be willing to let go of being liked by everyone. You must be willing to accept that some people will misunderstand you, disagree with you, even reject you, and you must move forward anyway, because the alternative is far worse. The alternative is a life where you are constantly adapting, constantly seeking, constantly waiting, never fully stepping into your own direction. And that is not a life of power. It is a life of quiet limitation. Most people will hear this and nod, maybe even agree, but they will not act on it. They will return to their patterns the moment they feel discomfort. They will choose familiarity over growth, approval over authority. And that is why they will remain exactly where they are, unchanged, predictable, controlled. So if you are going to take anything from this, let it be this. Stop asking for permission to be who you already are. Stop negotiating your identity in every interaction. Stop measuring your worth through reactions that change from moment to moment, and start operating from a place that does not require validation to exist. Because once you do, everything shifts. Not overnight, not dramatically, but fundamentally, in a way that cannot be reversed. And if you feel resistance to this, if part of you is uncomfortable, uncertain, hesitant, that is exactly why you need to confront it, not avoid it. Because that resistance is the boundary between who you have been and who you could become. And crossing that boundary is not easy. It is not comfortable. It is not immediate, but it is necessary. So watch this again, not to feel inspired, not to feel motivated, but to remind yourself of a truth you will be tempted to ignore the moment you step back into your routine. That the version of you who seeks approval will always remain limited, and the version of you who lets it go will always move forward. And the choice between those two versions is not made once. It is made every single day, in every interaction, in every decision, in every moment where you either stand firm or adjust to be accepted. And over time, those choices accumulate into a direction, a trajectory that defines your life. And the only question that remains is which direction you are going to choose.